I love incident response. I love being a blue teamer. So I know the red side is more sexy than the blue side, but I will try to walk you through my experience. So since a decade, I'm helping companies which are affected by a breach, which need forensic analysis support, just to get them back started. In that 40, 45-ish minutes, I showcase you some of my experience. Of course, it's not enough to get a whole, we could fill probably weeks with all that talks, and we also had a good conversation over lunch about incident response stories we could share with you. But in a nutshell, that's it. So the content for today's talk is, how do I even start an incident response case? Where do I start? If I'm tasked to analyze and examine a network consisting of 10,000 plus endpoints, you have to start somewhere. Work smarter, not harder. There are tools and shortcuts we can take as defenders. After all, and at the end of the day, streamline the process. Don't reinvent the wheel. Use tools and processes and common knowledge, which will make your life so much easier. New, in quotes, artifacts, which I personally use all day, or quite frequently, and it gives us so much advantage for against the attackers. Last but not least, track the attacker, and of course, what else? About me. So here's a quick fact about me. I'm doing incident response my whole professional life, over 12 years in various roles, various Swiss companies. Right now I'm head of investigation, so I'm managing the incident response team for the Swiss-based company InfoGuard. That's not a joke. My nickname is Malmö, so like the Swedish town, everybody calls me Malmö, but not my parents. They refuse to call it me Malmö since years. The proposal I submitted to Security Fest was how to become an incident response rockstar. Focusing on the most relevant forensic data can rapidly speed up the investigation process. And how's that? So when a new employee or somebody wants to join our incident response team, one of the first questions I ask them during the investigation, during the interview process is, given the scenario that the customer calls you and they said we have 10,000 plus endpoints, where do you start with the investigation? We can roll out forensic agents, we can roll out EDRs, you have access to every event log on the compromised network. Where do you start? In most times, it's just silence, because they are overwhelmed. Because when you're doing SANS courses and trainings, we have little or small networks, maybe one server, maybe 2 or 3 compromised servers. Where do we start? My personal opinion is what we or you should strive for is visibility. So I heard a couple of stories from different companies when a customer calls them and said, we had an active attacker in our network is breached. They solely examine one server or server with traces. I can tell you, in my experience, that's not enough. How do you tell if a server really touched only that network or that network segment you are analyzing right now? I heard about companies which are just using CAPE for single host forensics. And they, by the end of the day, maybe they managed to analyze 15 to 20 hosts. But personally, how do you cope with bigger networks? Do you think it's a really good idea only to focus on a small subset of a potentially fully compromised network? I personally, my advice to you is roll as much agents out as you can on every computer and on every server. I had so many phone calls with customers and said, could you help us rolling out the forensic agents? And I said, at this point in time, it's not my responsibility. You have to do it. And sometimes I refuse to start the engagement until the agents are fully rolled out. Otherwise, we are doing the work over and over again, maybe 2, maybe 3 times. But then again, if we as company or incident responder not fully investigate the breach and the whole network, I can guarantee you that the attackers will come back. And whose fault will it be by the end of the day? Of course, mine, because I was the lead incident responder in that case. It's simple. How do you find a needle in a haystack? It's easy, just bring a magnet. One of the first things I do when starting an investigation is I look at the antivirus logs all the time. I can guarantee you in most of our investigations, 90 or more % of the time, AV catched or saw some malicious activity of the attackers. It's easy as that. It's just because most companies don't really look at AV logs. They don't really care. What I heard so far was, we don't have time, we don't understand the event logs or the antivirus logs. This is a good example here. So in the upper left corner, you see real incident. That server was compromised with web shells. That was an Exchange server. The antivirus logs screamed more than 300 times, attacker, 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 attacker. Nobody was listening. So the evidence was really there. And that's one of so many examples I could tell you and show you how antivirus logs were neglected. Nobody was really paying attention to them. So one of the first things I personally do is open up the antivirus logs. I see staging folders, I see tools used by the attackers, I see compromised user accounts. So within half an hour, 50 minutes into the investigation, I have a good overview of the attackers. It's simple, yes, but nobody really does it, or have a look at it. That's funny because I tweeted that one here back in 22. If I had received the time for every time I mentioned Florian's cheat sheet, I wouldn't have to work anymore. So that's why I teamed up with Florian. And now I'm representing that slide here. No, seriously, it's so helpful. And maybe that slide here, or that overview from Florian Roth, is so underrated because I'm showing that all the time to customers. If you see something like Mimikatz, web shell, exploit, remote access tool, or Trojan, please call us. If you don't have the knowledge or the internal team which can really have a look at those alerts, you will be potentially ransomed on the next day, or they will steal your data. It's easy as that. It sounds simple. At the end of the day, it is as simple as just look at the logs. Next one, after the antivirus logs. Where's the next point or the next data pile I'm looking at? PowerShell logs. Again, here on the left side, that's from May this year. Average Twitter person, PowerShell is dead. I can guarantee you, PowerShell is not dead. We see it all the time in our cases. Again, if you are looking at the PowerShell logs, enable PowerShell script log login and search these logs for traces of attackers. You might strike gold there and you might find your attackers. It's so underrated, PowerShell logs. I'm preaching that stuff here since years. But all the time we are helping out customers which haven't enabled PowerShell script log logging globally. And all these scripts are not logged. So bad for us, or good for the attackers, bad for us as incident responders. Because this one here is also from a recent incident, not so recent, it's system BC, so a Trojan written in PowerShell. It was on a scheduled task within the run key. What we are seeing here is a new socket, TCP client with a redacted IP address, of course, and with a port number. And on the second red bracket, we see invoke expression. So that's the PowerShell term of running code. What the backdoor does, it's reach out to the internet, fetches code, and run those code on the host. It would be really easy when we are just ingesting and searching our PowerShell script log for traces like this one, searching for IP addresses within the event logs, searching for IAEX within the event logs. Again, here, that's not wizardry, that's just simple, it's not magic. After antivirus logs and AV logs, the next thing I personally look at is newly created services within the network. The first one, if you watched the talk yesterday from AD misconfigurations, one of the tools used was Impacket. Impacket, one of the tools from the Impacket suite, is SMB exec. These tools, they leave traces within our network. So the first one here is a newly created service from WMI, which the attacker used to move laterally through the network or execute commands on the remote host. It's not attackers, most of the time attackers can apply under their radar. They leave traces, mostly plainly visible traces within the network. It's totally a different story when we are up against APTs and stuff, nation state, of course. In most cases, what we as Defender are up to are organized cybercrime. So they want to steal data, they want to encrypt our data and encrypt our networks, and not nation-state attackers. So they leave traces inside the network. The next one here should be also relatively clear. Run DLL, which runs a TXT file? Don't think so. Keep in mind, attackers love legitimate tools, so remote monitoring and management tools are highly abused by attackers. They blend in as legitimate remote monitoring tools. How would you spot them as a defender? Is AnyDesk a legitimate installation here, or was it set up by the attacker? Same goes for Splashtop. And also keep in mind, attackers love also to drop vulnerable drivers onto disk. That vulnerable driver gets installed as a new service and enable the attacker to run code within the kernel to unload the EDR driver, for example, or to just run code within system context. There are plainly several aspects we could focus on when kickstarting the investigation. Within these 3 steps, I guarantee you, you will find something when you are up against an active attacker within your network. Maybe some of you thought I would start with auto-runs. Yeah, maybe that's a good guess, maybe not. Because what we are seeing here, also from a real incident, that's the non-sucking service manager. That's a legitimate tool used to restart and respawn services under Windows. When we are just looking at the auto-runs data, we see image path and sscm.exe. Nothing more. US defenders, we cannot tell what's behind that non-sucking service manager. So when you're just skimming through the auto-runs, you will not find evil, or you will not spot the backdoor. Because, legit, maybe. Auto-runs, I just reanalyzed it yesterday and made a screenshot yesterday. 4 out of, I don't know, 70 antivirus vendors flag it as malicious. That's Rising, Dr. Web, and 2 others not that well-known vendors. So most of the AD vendors will say that's a legitimate tool. It's really then in the details you have to look, because I recreated that attack path or that service within my own machine, within my own lab. And you really have to go to the newly created service from the non-service sucking manager, or vice versa, and then you see the parameters. Well, so what we are seeing here is the configuration is, or the executable started by the service is ngrok. So also a tool for tunneling back to the network, which is a nifty backdoor. So keep that in mind when you're just looking at the auto-runs, you might miss something. So I personally, of course, we are using auto-runs as well, but then maybe in a later step of the investigation. Personally, I'm lazy. I'm telling my team all the time I'm lazy. If we can automate something or make it easier for me at least, I take it, please. One of the things we as a team are using to get those famous first hits is a tool called Hayabusa. That's an open source tool. Maybe some of you heard it before. It's extremely powerful and capable of sifting through a ton of event logs and data and comparing those data, those event logs with Yara rules. So what you're seeing here is Hayabusa have over 3,000 plus Sigma alerts, and the output will be nicely separated and nicely columned about different techniques of the attackers. So we see critical alerts you have to look for, we see persistent mechanism. This Hayabusa tool is not like just a one-stop shop. You just run it through the network and the whole investigation is done. It might give you clues about the attackers. So incident response is all about time. Most of the time it's really critical, of course, when the network is encrypted anyways. Maybe we have some more time. In a good amount of our investigations, the attackers were active inside the network, meaning they could possibly encrypt the network anytime. So speed is really crucial and critical. You have to be working really fast. And such tools could give you a good head start against the attackers. It's all about finding the first needle in the haystack. Around those needles, or the first needle in the haystack, you can really build up the investigation, because you know IOCs, indicators of compromise. That might be IP addresses, that might be user accounts which are compromised, that might be tools and staging folders where the attacker used to place the tool. The same goes for Detect Raptor, Velociraptor, an open source tool which is highly powerful and really recommended. If you don't know it, please have a look at it. It's open source, it's amazing. I'm not saying that you should use it in your investigations, but you could use it. We as InfoGuard, in most of our cases, we are using it as well. Because, for example, what we are seeing here is Detect Raptor. It's more or less a bit the same thing as the Hayabusa. Detect Raptor, once Velociraptor is rolled out on the whole network, is collecting or searching through event logs, through the master file table, through services, and looking for malicious keywords. Again, it's just about finding the first hit, finding as much information about the attacker as you can in as less time as there is. Because, for example, how would you possibly know all the RRM, also these remote monitoring solution tools there are out there? When I'm looking at autoruns, it could be overwhelming, to say the least, because I know colleagues and from other companies, when they looked at the autoruns output, they made mistakes, because just saying 20 hours into the investigation, you get tired. 20 hours into the investigation, you may be a bit tired. So it's not really clear what you should focus on. What you are seeing here is all the tools, legitimate tools abused by attackers. And attackers love to plant these tools as legitimate backdoors. Detect Raptor, on the other hand, have a list of all these tools, about these legitimate tools, and it will pinpoint it out to us within no time. So we could use it as a first start into our investigation. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that you should rely only on these quick hits or quick wins. Once you check the autoruns, when you check the antivirus logs, once you check the services, once you run tools like Hayabusa and Velociraptor's Detect Raptor, you must do a deep dive into the affected hosts, be it with CAPE, being with other tools, but then again, we as incident responders or as defenders must gather as much information about the attackers as we can. It's not enough just to rely on tools. That's what makes us experts in our field. We must really pinpoint exactly what the attacker have done on that specific systems. It's really about just speeding up the investigation, like I said several times before, because here comes a good example of that. Once we identified such a tool, so such one of these RMM tools, we should look at the installation date of that folder. We should look if that tool installed by the attackers have logs. If you don't know the tool, check out the folders or read about the folders or read about the tool. What I'm doing if I have time, if the incident is not so critical, I download the tool, I spin up a fresh VM and I install the tool with Sysmon enabled or whatever, EDR, and then you see the files written by the tools. Have a look at the files written by the tools and look what's written in it, because you might strike gold here, because we see the connection was not successful. In this case here, which means the customer has a proxy, which means we might find other traces from the attacker inside the proxy logs, which means also we don't have to really care about that backdoor here because the connection was not successful. So you see, if I would just say, okay, attacker installed tool, okay, move on. But When we are going deeper, we find more information about the attackers, which gives us, again, more indicators of compromise, which, again, gives us more confidence that the network will be safe by the end of the day. It could be tricky, though. What I'm saying is, pay attention to details. What we are seeing here is also from a real-life case. That was an attacker who installed an SSH agent, so a legitimate backdoor which connects back to the internet to a host. Again, in autoruns, maybe you just see SSH, no antivirus will flag that as malicious. How do we find such stuff? Yeah, maybe with event logs, maybe with installed tools or installed services, maybe with checking the proxy logs. It could be really complicated when you're tasked about, so your task will be examine a whole network. Where do you start? Maybe you have two colleagues which are helping you. Maybe you are a single incident responder, but then again, time is critical. So we strive to automate as much as possible. What we are doing typically when a new customer calls us and we have to go full incident response or kickstart the incident response modus, we provide the customer with Velociraptor installation binaries. Once the Velociraptor agents are installed throughout the network, what we are doing is we are collecting 20-something artifacts, forensic artifacts. You see a snippet here, antivirus logs, we talked about that, and autoruns, we talked about that, PowerShell logs, security logs, etc., running processes, evidence of execution. Next, all the data collected by Velociraptor or by other forensic agents or EDR tools, we are feeding that data to a Splunk instance or use whatever CM instance you have in place. The good thing is here, once you've collected all that data, you can really sort the data or search again for malicious keywords. That's why it's so important to ingest these data, these PowerShell script logs. What you are seeing here is invoke expression, again, we talked about that. So invoke expression runs code within PowerShell. We see here download string, localhost address, and then invoke something. Anybody knows what that is? It's Cobalt Strike. So when you see that one here, that PowerShell artifact, without knowing more about the attackers, just looking at these logs, I know immediately Cobalt Strike was active or is still active on that host. Why? Because PowerShell import command loads for PowerShell script into beacon. This script stays in memory for the duration of the beacon session. What I'm trying to say here is you don't have to scan the whole memory in your first step of the incident response, because pinpointing the attacker or puzzling the pieces together from the attacker, you might find something which points to a different direction. So because we see here the PowerShell artifacts and this invoke expression with the localhost address followed by invoke nightmare or find local admin access, we know that a Cobalt Strike beacon is running on that server, on that host, which means we should extract the memory or just using Yara rules for hunting through the memory. Next one. We ingest also the security event logs, which is extremely powerful when you have all the security event logs in one place. Sort them by failed logins. What we are seeing here is we sort by failed login, so 4625, compared to the successful login 4624, and then you see immediately which host was used by the attackers for a password spray, which user account was maybe used for that action, and so on. The next one is also important and also interesting. This one here are the remote desktop protocol event logs. Funny thing is, a couple of attackers, they are deleting the event logs, the security event logs, but they don't keep in mind that when they are using RDP logs to a different event logs. So keep that in mind as defender. All is not lost when the attacker deletes the logs. We still have, or we still might have a chance to catch them otherwise. Look for external IP addresses within your event logs, the security event logs. I found so many traces of attackers just looking at external IP addresses within the event logs. If you have a CM and ingesting the security event logs, nevertheless, as today, do a regular expression hunt on these IP addresses. You might catch an attacker on an early stage here. Next one goes for suspicious locations, excuse me. That might be noisy, but attackers love staging folders. Most of the time they are abusing C users public, or they folder videos, or they folder like images or whatever. See Windows 10 is a good example. Once with that search here, with your EDR agent or with Velociraptor, that's so powerful. We are searching through the whole file system, and with a flag here below, calculate hash. We also get the hash, so the MD5 or SHA-265, so that we could potentially run also an automated virus total lookup here. Again, search for keywords. You see pictures, Sky-Network Advanced Port Scanner, pictures. That's so common, at least in our incident response cases. Attackers are noisy in the most of the time, or most of the cases. They don't really care about stealth. Why? Because we as defender, we are still neglecting our logs. I don't know if you are aware of ThreatFox from abuse.ch. So Roman Hüssi, a Swiss guy as well. He is providing a ton of open source data about current threats, about C2 IP addresses, about C2 botnets and whatnot. You could download these data free of charge. What we are doing is we take this data and enrich our Splunk instance with it. So here we see the network collection or the network connections we collected with our EDR agent or with Velociraptor, and we enrich these data. So we do a mapping. If a network connection, which is live in the customer's network, is connecting out to a well-known C2 address, what I have to do as an incident responder, I just filter the table. Is it malicious? So here, Cobalt Strike or malware IP, and I find evil in no time. That's so great. I'm personally a huge fan of enrich data as much as you can with open source tooling, with open source information. You don't have to work for this. You don't have to scan the internet for C2 channels. Somebody else have done it for you. Case solved? Yeah, well, not really, right? Like I said before, I personally use a lot of different artifacts, not new artifacts. That's why here in quotes. I love the Bitmap cache. How many of you have heard of the Bitmap cache? Please raise your hands. Oh, wow, okay, not that much. So essentially, when you're doing an investigation or the attacker are using remote desktop as the lateral movement protocol, they might leave traces. Remote desktop, from time to time, create piles. So it screenshots, essentially, the desktop the attacker is seeing. And what we are seeing here, that's from a real incident. You could, let me switch here. We could take that Bitmap cache, and there are open source tools available for parsing that data. What you get with that data is exactly this one. It's a bit of data and work, so you have work to do to really check the data, check the piles of that data. But you might strike gold here, because that's also from a real incident. We found out that the attacker exfiltrated data to MegaNZ, to that well-known file sharing or exporting platform. What we saw and what we found in that Bitmap cache was the credentials to the account of the attacker. That's awesome. And that's not the only thing we found, or we still find up today in our cases. You see user accounts maybe in the screenshot which the attacker used. You see passwords from the attackers. You see C2 address from the attackers in those screenshots. It's awesome. It's underrated. So if you haven't knew about it, use it in your next investigation. Next one, also one of my favorites, it's SRAM. So SRAM is System Resource Utility Monitoring. Task Manager keeps also track about the open programs, how much CPU they consumed, to which IP addresses they connected to, and how much data were sent out to. That's useful because we had a case once where we knew that data was exfiltrated by the attacker because we found traces of a tool called Steelbit. Back in the day then, that was a known tool by an attacker, by a ransomware affiliate. However, the customer had no VPN, had no firewall logs, so we were not aware how much data they stole. The only thing we knew was they've done something with the data. Looking at the SRAM data here, you see on the right-hand side the received and the sent bytes of this tool you are looking for, which prove in one way or another that data was exchanged with the platform. That's awesome. If you don't find traces of tools or executed by the attackers in these places we are looking for, shim cache, M cache, or whatever, you still might find traces within the SRAM artifact. It is super, super noisy though. One time, it's an inside joke from our team, one time I ran an SRAM collection throughout the fleet. So it was a big network and all the agents sending back gigabytes of data from the SRAM database. Our Splunk instance, our CM instance was flooded for days because Splunk couldn't cope up with the ingestion of the logs. Defender alerts. Like I said, I love AV logs. What you are seeing here is only a Defender alert, pinpointing suspicious remote copy. Oh, okay. Well, that's not really helpful, is it? It's just an alert. There is another log file by Microsoft Defender. It's called the MPlog. It's Microsoft Protection Log. Inside the Microsoft Protection Logs, you might find more details about the detection we saw here. We use that so many times in our investigation just to prove something or to get more information about an IV alert, like we're seeing here. So before, we just knew that WMI PRFSE.exe spawned something. And now we are seeing here, it spawned CMD, and CMD in turn spawned PowerShell, which tries to download something. If you haven't knew about the MPlog, you will find a good blog from CrowdStrike about the MPlog. It's awesome, really. We found traces of web shells in that log. We found traces of data exfiltration. MPlog sometimes also tracks renamed binaries. So at one point in time, I remember an investigation I've done where peeling, so the putty executable, was renamed to ekern.exe. And this renaming was recorded by the MPlog. So again, check all the artifacts you can get hold of. You might strike gold. Don't rely on the well-known artifacts. Use new artifacts to get more information. Same as shellbacks. So in Windows Explorer, when you are using the graphical explorer and you are moving the explorer to the left Windows side or right one, Windows keeps track of the location and the size of Explorer and records in which folder the user were at that moment in time. Again, we can use that information, the shellbacks, we can parse them in our investigations and find traces of the attackers. So here we see Mimi. Yeah, well, Mimi. Mimikatz, for example. Mimikatz, PC Hunter, Auto, RDP Pwn, also a tool. Without looking at further information, without looking at mcache or executed commands, we still can find traces of the attackers. The master file table is like a phone book of Windows, which keeps track about every file created on Windows, deleted by Windows, in which directory and not. I personally, when I talked about deep dive and doing forensic deep dive, I personally create every time a, how do you say, like a timetable around the incident from the master file table. Why? Because at this point in time, I should have collected a good amount of information about the attacker, about indicators of compromise, about tools he used, about IP addresses. And right now, I can create a timeline of the hosts which were touched by the attackers. And if I just sort by date or by time, I might find further tools and executables by the attackers in no time. Otherwise, how should I know which files were recently created by the attackers if I don't find traces in the executable or in the shim cache or ARM cache, so the artifacts which keep tracks of the executed programs? So again, you still have so many options to track adversaries, to track attackers throughout the network. Last one is the journal. So if the master file table keeps track of all the files which are present or deleted inside Windows, the journal is more or less like, he keeps track, so the journal keeps track of all the files recently written on the file system. If you don't find a trace here in the master file table, that could be because the file is overwritten, so Windows marks the file as erased, and on the next iteration, it could be that a newly created file overwrites the entry in the master file table with that entry, so we don't find traces here. In the journal, there might be also still traces left by the attackers. And with a path regex or a file name regex, we could search for traces, for tools, and indicators of compromise we knew from our investigation before. Track the attacker, of course. At some point, the attacker must have entered our network, otherwise we won't do incident response. I think one of the really, really underrated things is as simple as it could get. Check for default file names, desktop, Windows. If your company is following a naming convention with DHCP logs and whatnot, you might identify a suspicious device or a suspicious host name in no time. I can tell you and I can guarantee you that so many times I saw Windows/desktop/. It's so common, even when the attackers are using VPN to enter the network, be it because they stole credentials or they just use a vulnerability to get an entry point in our network. It will stand out. The same is for the VPN logs. So many times we just filter for desktop or Windows within the VPN logs, or just filter for countries, again, enrich the data. What we are seeing in the VPN logs are just IP addresses, enrich these IP addresses with geolocation information. It's really easy as that. You don't have to be a wizard to do all these checks, but it's just, sometimes I think companies are not doing it because of, I don't know, lack of time maybe. It's really these simple checks. Ingest all the VPN logs you have, ingest the DHCP logs, and check for anomalies within your network. Traces were not created out of thin air on the systems, of course not. So it's really elementary that you trace back the attacker throughout the network from point A to point B to point C, and then you will find the patient zero. Finding patient zero is so critical, otherwise they will come back. So in most of our cases, we were able to pinpoint really the whole attack path, like we see, or like we saw in the talk yesterday, for the people who attended, where our colleagues from Sweden really showcased a full attack circle from the attacker. To wrap up this presentation, what else? Incident response is a ton about doing really deep dive technical stuff. But on the other hand, it's also, you need a ton of, you must really talk a lot in this role with CEOs, with CFOs, with other techies, maybe with the marketing department or with lawyers and so on. So don't underestimate the soft skills you need to be a really good incident responder. The days are gone when you just could sit in front of your computer and just hacking along, at least what I know and see on my colleagues, so in different teams. Delegate tasks. That might be one of the most important things and slides here. It's not about being brilliant in doing forensic works. I saw brilliant colleagues which forgot or made errors because they were just overworked. They had too many emails from the customer where they just should give an answer which was really just important to give the client an answer, or the phone was ringing all the time and they were just really stressed and they forgot about checking for persistence mechanism. We saw that, or we had that as well. And so keep that in mind. Resource management is a really big and huge topic. It's not you against the adversary, so please work in teams, delegate tasks, make sure you're sleeping enough, make sure you're drinking enough. And also after the incident, take your time to do something else, because I'm a manager of my team, of an incident response team, and I can guarantee you that as well. How many times had I conversation with my team colleagues because they were close to burnout, close to being just exhausted from that stressful work. So physical or mental health is really a thing also in our area of expertise. To wrap up here, the common mistakes: change passwords. Do not rely on the customer to change, or when the customer tell you, I changed the passwords, don't rely on it, because I saw it multiple times. The passwords were not changed, the attacker are coming back. Remediation: do not rely on the customer to disable, uninstall, remove backdoors and code. Do it for yourself, or at least check it. Backdoors, visibility is the key. Again, install agents on every computer, on every server in the network. People management: overworked, overloaded staff make mistakes. I can tell you that. So the conclusion: incident response, a combination of deep technical knowledge, project management skills, people management, and yeah, visibility is the key. Search for the first hit, do a deep dive, and make the network secure again. Questions, please.
Okay. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions in the crowd? We have a few, actually. Okay. Which is good. All right.
You get one.
Thank you for a killer presentation. One of the most important things while conducting incident response is documenting all the finds, taking notes. I found this, found that. How do you best go on about that?
Ongoing discussion, huge topic. We are using Aurora, so it's maybe if you have taken a science class, you know that Aurora, just for taking notes of incident response, of indicators of compromise, of affected hosts, compromised users. But we are working also on a Splunk investigation dashboard so that we can pinpoint findings within Splunk. But then again, everybody is working differently. I use also Obsidian, OneNote, just plain old notes. I don't really have a good answer to that, I'm sorry. It's really a huge discussion also all the time in my team. It's tricky, yes. Yes.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. Do you come across attackers using COM objects a lot in incidents, and how do you go about investigating what the COM object can do without having to reverse engineer it?
Not that often. We hardly see it. But then again, if you find traces, you must really conduct a deep dive investigation. And this investigation takes time. So I really start on a low level, picking up or picking the low-hanging fruits as much as I can, so I have more time for the really deep dive investigation later on.
Okay, do we have anyone else? Any more questions? One here. Let's see, how do I get to you?
Thank you for your presentation. What if an attacker is living off the land? Do you have any IOCs that we can look for to differentiate the normal traffic from what he is using?
Yeah, for example, a well-known binary is PowerShell, right? So ingest all the PowerShell logs you can. But whatever, what is normal traffic versus what's not normal traffic. So for example, if an attacker using PowerShell just to blend in, you might find something invoke something or download something, PowerShell download code from the internet. It's a tricky question. But then again, even if an attacker is using living off the land binaries, they might download like additional software for setting up persistence. They might create a new service, and with all those information, you might be able to catch them as well. So nobody, at least not in my cases, no, not an attacker were perfect up as today. They make mistakes, firstly, and in most cases, they want to persist. So they are still setting up backdoors. They're still setting up or running code to set up persistency.
Okay, looks like that's it for now. So thank you so much. And let's give him a warm hand.
Thank you.